delays involved here. But now if I go back, because the session hosts that are part of this session desktop are part of the dynamic, or are a part of this group, basically the target device group that we configured, voila, I got SSO. I wasn't shown that re-authentication experience. I wasn't shown the consent prompt. I just came all the way through from my client, where I had already artifact for my Woodgrove tenant. So even though this is my Microsoft desktop with my Microsoft credentials as the primary, because I also have a work account with Woodgrove, I had the PRT. I was able to get that same SSO all the way through to the target device.
Hello and welcome to the last live 425 show of 2023. Where has the year gone? If you happen to get any slow days over this holiday season, don't forget to go and take a look at all of our previous sessions at aka.ms/45show/videos so that you can get some great ideas for your 2024 strategy, because I don't know what else you'd be doing in your downtime over the holiday break. But enough about 2023, let's talk about today. So today we have an absolute cracker, first pun of the session, of a show for you, and a personal highlight of the year, maybe even my career at Microsoft, to be honest. And I'm so excited to be accompanied by Sandeep and David today to get the rundown on the very exciting GA announcement of passwordless single sign-on with Entra ID authentication and WebAuthn redirection for in-session passwordless authentication for AVD in Windows 365. So Sandeep and David, would you like to introduce yourselves to our eager audience, please?
Thanks, Grace. So my name is Sandeep Dio. I'm a principal product manager in the Identity and Network Access division, and I'm primarily responsible for modern devices scenario and supporting passwordless single sign-on to Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 is one of the core scenarios I own within Identity. Over to you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Sandeep. My name is David Bélanger. I am one of the principal product manager on the Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 team. For the last 3 or 4 years, I've been focusing a lot on our identity and authentication investments. That's why I work very closely with Sandeep on this, and also driving some of our cloud native investments to eventually be able to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop without the need of any Active Directory in your environment. Grace, back to you.
Thank you. So it has been a long and very exciting journey, which I had the pleasure of being a very small part of over the past many years where this has been in development. And so we finally announced at Ignite a few weeks ago the general availability of passwordless SSO with Entra ID for AVD and Windows 365. And this has been a humongous ask for customers. And it's not only around making it easier and providing a better end user experience. This is also about security and providing support for phish resistant credentials that satisfies even some of the most strict regulations that we see our customers needing to abide by. So don't be a turkey, second pun, and stay tuned, and don't hesitate to ask questions or provide feedback in the feeds. So we will be discussing these live on air, so get your questions in, and if you're listening back on YouTube, then feel free to comment in the video and our team will get back to you. So Sandeep and David, take it away. Feel free to add more Christmassy puns as well if you feel that way inclined.
Thank you, Grace. Are folks able to see the slide?
Yep, you're good to go.
Awesome. So thank you again. So today we're going to be doing a deep dive, both David and I, on single sign-on as well as in-session passwordless using WebAuthn redirection for both Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365. We have a packed agenda today. As typical, we're going to start with the what, why, and how. We'll get into some of the prerequisites to use these scenarios. We'll talk a bit more in depth on the authentication flows for both the single sign-on as well as the in-session passwordless. And we also have some cool demos to show, and then we'll wrap it up with a roadmap in terms of what's next for us. And then we'll take any Q&A, time permitting, or any other that Grace or folks can catch offline. So with that, we'll start with the what. So we really embarked on this journey, I would say probably a little over a year ago, year and a half ago, on uh, enabling the most secure and productive Azure native OS and credential agnostic remote desktop connection experience, right? So this was more around ensuring when our deployments are happening in the cloud, regardless of the OSs our customers are using as their client devices, we want to support all credentials that Entra ID support when it comes to connecting to these virtualized environments, right? Be it Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365, right? So that was one of the big objectives we had. We also wanted to make sure we have support for passwordless authentication, so not just any credentials like password, which we again ask customers not to use. Passwordless is the future, is the right way to go and deploy for any authentication needs on your end. We also wanted to ensure that customers had a way to enforce security using our conditional access capabilities. And then providing single sign-on, right, inside the session for any Entra ID-based applications website was also one of the key objectives we set for ourselves. And then in doing all of this, we also wanted to ensure that customers did not require any complex infrastructure to make this work, right? We wanted it to work with existing services that customers have with very minimal, little or minimal, additional infra, right? But nothing complicated. I'm excited to mention that if you haven't caught up yet, at Microsoft Ignite this year in November, we did announce general availability of both of these experiences, the single sign-on as well as the in-session passwordless. Going into the why, right? This is important to level set in terms of what we had prior to this, right? If you recall some of the past experiences we had for connecting to a remote desktop, we offered limited platform support, right? So, for example, the passwordless credential support that we had previously was in very few scenarios. So, for example, you could do smart card authentication, you could do Windows Hello, but even Windows Hello for Business was supported only in certain deployment models and not all. And this was only for Windows, right? So when it came to non-Windows, the only option customers had was to use password, which was again a big downside. I don't know how many of you recall, but in the past, when you were trying to connect to a Microsoft Entra joined host, you had to come from a client, a Windows client that also had a device identity with your tenant, right? So that also posed a big challenge for a lot of customers, especially when they were using remote, like personal devices, and they didn't want the identity to be present on that device, but they couldn't connect it unless they actually went and registered, right? So that was another key challenge. And the last one, the big one, was we did not offer single sign-on. So whenever you saw the RDP client, it would again prompt you for authenticating to your target device. So the customers or the end users had to re-enter their password, right, or their credential, which was again a pain point. Also, we didn't provide any support for IDPs that federated with Entra ID. So a lot of customers who are in that deployment model were also having issues. And the last and the main reason also is the executive order, right? 14028 that President Biden signed a few years back actually requires government agencies to adopt a phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, right? And that requirement also applies to remote desktop connection experiences, right? So this is all the reasons why we wanted to invest in a new model that offers and sort of takes away all of these limitations and also addresses some of the needs I mentioned in the what. In terms of how did we approach this, right? How did we go about supporting these scenarios? So there were three key areas that we had to go modify to make these scenarios work. Starting with Entra ID, obviously we had to go implement a new protocol. We had to add support for Entra ID based token for RDP access. We refer to it as RDP access token. Today, we have a way to issue RDP access token for approved apps. It's currently applicable to Azure Virtual Desktop, Windows 365, and Microsoft Remote Desktop for any P2P connections. We also added support for an admin configurable policy on service principal. This is to enable SSO, and you'll see that later in the demo. We will highlight that. And last but not the least, we added support for conditional access to provide you the ability to enforce strong authentication, right, when you're trying to access a session host. In terms of the changes on the RDP team, definitely we had to go make changes to the AVD and Windows 365 clients as the MSRDC basically, as well as the remote desktop connection client, the MSTSC that ships natively with Windows. We had to go modify that to ensure that it can actually use RDP access token, the new token that Entra ID issues, to authenticate to the session host. And then there were additional changes on the portal side to allow customers to configure their host pool with the RDP property, as well as if you're doing a Windows 365 provisioning policy, for you to be able to enable SSO and so on. And lastly, on the MSTSC, the native UI that ships with Windows, we had to go update to expose the new way to authenticate with a target device. And last but not the least, key changes on the Windows OS itself. Basically, we had to go update the RDP credential provider to handle this new RDP access token, and then basically use this to sign in the user. And then after you sign in, get the SSO artifact, namely, primary refresh token that sort of, primes the entire operating system to provide you with the SSO experience when accessing any Entra ID resources, as well as if you want to have access to on-prem, we also provide a TGT as part of that sign-in experience. So this is at a high level, the changes we had to go through in all of these different components to make this capability available for you folks. In terms of the prerequisites, when it comes to deploying AVD session host or a Windows 365 cloud PC, this is supported on newer OSs like Windows 10 and 11, as well as with Windows Server 2022. We had issued a patch update back in October of 2022. So if you have that, then you have all the requirements that you can meet. In terms of the join state, you do need the device, in this case, the session host or the Windows 365 Cloud PC, to be either in the Entra join or Entra hybrid join state. We do not support just standard domain join deployments. You have to have a device identity with Entra ID in one of those two states I mentioned. And if you are basically deploying an Entra hybrid join, or even in the Entra join case, if you have scenarios that require you to have your users access to on-prem resources, you do need to deploy a Kerberos server object, right? This is basically establishing the trust from your on-premises Active Directory to your Microsoft Entra ID tenant using Entra ID Cloud Kerberos, right? So that's the other requirement you have. In terms of local device, there's really no requirement on the join state. So if you recall the prior experiences, like I mentioned on Windows, you had to have a device identity in the same tenant as the target device if you needed to connect, but that requirement doesn't apply anymore. So that's good news for a lot of customers who basically wanted to use a client without any join state to connect. In terms of platforms, we have a good broad support here with Windows 10, 11. We have web clients that work on any other platforms. We have native RDP clients that work on Mac OS, iOS, and Android. So good support matrix there. In terms of the user can be either cloud native or it can be a hybrid identity. And in terms of identity provider, like we previously mentioned, it's not just Microsoft Entra ID, but you also get to we also support integration with third party as long as they're federated with the Microsoft Entra ID system. So that's on the prerequisites. I'll walk you through the flow. This is how we authenticate from the client all the way to the target device. So the first thing that happens is the RDP client basically uses the broker components from the identity stack to request an RDP access token from the target device. And this device, like we mentioned, is a device that's registered in Entra as either Entra joined or hybrid. So when you request for an RDP access token, you either provide the device ID of that device or you provide a fully qualified domain name, right? That's sort of the requirement when you're requesting for the RDP access token. Entra ID will issue the RDP access token. These tokens are bound to the client and the target device. And there are a couple of checks that happen before issuing this RDP access token. If the default experience is the user will be asked to authenticate and accept the what we call as a consent prompt. So think of this as replacing the previously server host authentication. So if the user has already previously consented, or if the admin has configured the SSO policy, which we will show you later, then the user doesn't need to authenticate, right? Then they get the SSO all the way through. But if they haven't accepted the consent prompt prior, or if the admin hasn't configured SSO policy, the first time experience, they will see a consent prompt where they have to authenticate, accept that they are connecting to the right target device, and then they are allowed in. And then we also evaluate any conditional access policies where if you're enforcing a certain posture of a client device, like it has to be managed or it has to be compliant, or you require the user to satisfy a strong authentication or multi-factor, whatever the case may be, we make sure all those policies are satisfied before we issue the RDP access token. So let's assume all of those conditions are met. The client gets the RDP access token. The next thing the client does is it will connect to the target host doing a regular TLS handshake. And as part of protocol negotiation, it knows, hey, it can talk the new protocol. It's going to basically send the RDP access token as a credential, right, to the target device or to terminal server. In this case, the target host, it receives the RDP access token, it will validate, and then it will basically initiate a network logon, right? And there are a few other nuances. It will try and use the cache logon if you've previously logged into that device. If it cannot, then it will do a proper logon and all of that, right? At that stage, basically, once it tries to authenticate to the user, it's that same token that is consumed by the target logon stack, right, to authenticate to Entra ID. And then you have that remote logon session which gets spawned. At this point in time, the user is fully authenticated on the target machine. Entra ID at that point is issuing a PRT, which is a primary refresh token to provide you the SSO experience, as well as it provides a Kerberos TGT, so that if you have a need to access any on-prem resources, you can do that using, again, getting single sign-on. And then last thing it does is if for some reason the session has to reconnect because it got locked or it was disconnected, you again start from step one, right, where the client is going to re-ask or request the RDP access token and so on. So pretty straightforward, but very, very powerful in the sense that it provides a much more secure as well as a productive experience all the way through from your client, any client, basically OS agnostic, credential agnostic, all the way to your native cloud deployments with Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365. In terms of the experience, this is the experience that some of the users may see. Again, this is only if the single sign-on policy is not configured. Again, we recommend, and we've seen a lot of customers have expressed and have shown a desire to actually configure the single sign-on policy for all their Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 deployments, because these are their trusted deployments where they have full control on these endpoints to manage, to push policies to ensure they're compliant, they meet all the security baselines and all of that. And in which case they basically are saying, hey, since we have this control environment that we manage, we are okay letting our users get the SSO behavior from their client device when they connect to our target AVD or Windows 365 PC. So a lot of your users deploying this will not see it, but in case you don't have that SSO policy deployed, this is the experience that is enabled by default. You will be asked to authenticate. And once you authenticate, you will see this prompt which tells you, hey, are you okay to connect to this particular host name? It will actually show the host name of the target device. And once you say yes, that's when you will basically connect. Now, again, in terms of how this works is if you connect to the same machine again, we remember up to 15 hosts for 30 days. So if you connect to the same machine again within the 30-day window, you will not see this prompt. which means then you will get the SSO behavior. But if you haven't consented before, you will, right? And like I said, if you have SSO policy configured, you will not see this at all. And that's sort of the goal for the AVD and Windows 365 deployments. In terms of conditional access policies, there are really two main areas here. Rather, three components. There is the subscription service from AVD, which is the RD Web. There is the gateway API, and then there is the actual session host, right, that you connect to. Now, both the AVD RD Web and AVD RDB Gateway is all mapped as a single resource called Azure Virtual Desktop. So anytime you go launch remote desktop client, you're subscribing to a feed, that's when the RD Web and the RD Gateway is coming into play. So any policies, any conditional access policies you have on this application is what experience your users will see on when they launch remote desktop app. We recommend this to have a little lower posture because there are things that continue to happen in the background, like sending diagnostics data, doing silent feed refreshes every few hours. So we want to make sure those experiences continue to work. So you want to not have interrupts, because otherwise those experiences will fail because they're happening without any user interaction.
And Sandeep,
yeah.
While we're here and talking about conditional access policies, can you talk a little bit about kind of the new strong authentication and how that ties into this? And to piggyback into a question from Mark, who was asking if this will support Microsoft Entra ID passkeys when it lands in January 24th.
Oh, absolutely, right? So any credential we support will be supported as part of this experience, right? Any credential in Entra ID. So once you have passkeys, you'll still be able to use the strong authentication. Basically, instead of just require a multi-factor authentication, you'll be able to use require authentication strength as a grant control, and then select within that what really type of credential you want to enforce as part of this connection. Just like any other resource via CA you want to protect, you're able to also apply that to both AVD RD Web /gateway plus AVD session host. The only nuance I was calling out here is you want to keep separate posture for your Azure Virtual Desktop as the resource versus the Microsoft Remote Desktop or Windows Cloud Login. And I'll get to that in a minute, because this is really about launching the remote desktop client and getting access to your feed, and then still letting the remote desktop client send its diagnostic data, send information about acquiring silently, those feed refreshes and so on. So you want to keep the posture slightly, I wouldn't say less secure, but keep it to a point where you don't want to really have any user interrupts, because you're not going to be able to satisfy those, and any diagnostic information uploads or any silent feed refreshes will fail. But the real posture where you want to really harden things are when someone is trying to connect from their client device to the session host. So did that answer the question for Mark?
Yes, I think so. And thank you, Mark, for posting the question. And I just want to invite others that are watching this live to please post your questions. We are watching, and we will try to do our best to answer them during the course of this presentation.
Yep. Okay. Now, the second policy is really going to be around what posture you want when you for the session host itself. So today, as part of the general announcement, the clients are still requesting the RDP access token for this resource, which is a Microsoft Remote Desktop. Because Microsoft Remote Desktop is being used for both Azure Virtual Desktop, Windows 365, and the Microsoft Remote Desktop P2P, we are working on transitioning this to using Windows Cloud Login, which will be a new resource that you will be able to target in CA soon. So we will be in the process next year of updating our clients to request RDP access tokens for this resource for both AVD and Windows 365 scenarios. So when that happens, there will be communication sent out and guidance for you, but we'll basically ask you to target CA policies for this resource when it comes to AVD and Windows 365. Again, you want to have a strong posture like require FIDO or passkeys or phone sign-in, but something that is really a strong authentication, or even Windows Hello for that matter, but definitely passwordless, right? You want to go do that. I think this was what I had, and I'm going to hand it over to David to cover some of the next slides, and then I'll come back to do a demo. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Sandeep. And a quick shout out to Andrew, who's also watching us live from the UK. So thank you for joining us, Andrew, and also others from the UK. Grace, did you have a comment before I jump in?
Yes, I do just have one question. So Sandeep, you mentioned about the consent prompt. So actually, how can the admins configure that SSO policy to pre-consent for those target machines with device groups? How do they actually go about doing that?
It's a good question. I have it in a demo coming up in a few. So we'll
awesome. Okay, can't wait to see it.
All right, let's jump into the session log behavior, since we've certainly gotten a lot of questions about it when we released the single sign-on. So for those of you that have started playing with single sign-on, either during the public preview, we had a lot of interest during the public preview, or even now that it's generally available, you will quickly notice that there's a change of behavior when the remote session gets locked. So in the past, with our older protocols, authentication protocol, normally if you lock the session, it will just display the remote lock screen. With the new experience, the session will actually get disconnected, and the user will see a little dialogue that lets them know that the session was disconnected because the remote session was locked, and kind of that's why it's happening. And then across all of our different clients, there's an easy option to just click reconnect. And because this is part of single sign-on, when they're ready, they can click reconnect and go right back into the session. In a lot of cases, without having to re-enter their credentials, barring the controls that you have as an admin to decide how frequently users will be reprompted for authentication through sign-in frequency policies, and other types of CA policies like Sandeep was mentioning. So that's the new behavior that's happening, right, where it disconnects the session. Some of the key reasons why we've done that. In general, we don't really see the remote lock screen as a hard security boundary. Like while it's available, a lot of people are still using it. One, we want to make sure that it can't just be spoofed. It also makes it where the user has a different authentication process, either for the initial connection or when they're unlocking their session. And generally, we believe it's safer to just disconnect the session in general instead of just leaving a live connection going to the server. So that's kind of reason number one. Reason number two is the remote lock screen in Windows has a limited set of credential types that it actually supports. Primarily, it supports username and password and some certificate-based authentication like smart cards, or even like Sandeep mentioned earlier, Windows Hello for Business certificate trust. But again, that's only when you're coming in from Windows typically. So that's part number two. Is one of the key goal of this new protocol is we wanted to provide a great passwordless authentication, and we wanted to make sure that every part of the system provided that passwordless authentication support and guaranteed that instead of having to go down to username and password only and some forms of certificates. So that was kind of reason number two. Reason number three is by disconnecting the session and then relaunching the connection when the user is ready, we're able to reevaluate all of the conditional access policies before the user gets back in, right? So the user could get disconnected after 4 hours in the session and all that. So we want to make sure it's still the same, the right user, their status hasn't changed, they haven't moved to a different network or things like that. So we will always reevaluate the CA policies at that point. And then the last part, again, I've kind of touched on this already. This provides a more consistent authentication, always through Entra ID. So whether it's at the beginning of the session, if you have a need to re-authenticate, then you'll be prompted through Entra ID. Or if you get disconnected at some point later, you again would go through Entra ID. Again, this is really for the cases where you as an admin decide that you want to reprompt your users. For example, you could choose on your managed devices to be more lax because you are controlling their local machines. You can set locking policies and all that on the local machine. So you may not put a sign-in frequency or maybe once a day, versus if you're coming in on a BYOD device, for example, you may have a more restrictive conditional access policy that might require a re-authentication policy, let's say every hour, for example. So we will go based on what you've configured in CA policy and ensure that still meets those criteria when the user gets back in. Now, that said, there's a lot of reasons why we made the design change that we did, and that's what we kind of ship. But since then, we have gotten certainly some feedback from some customers where the experience or not confusing, like moving too far off from the current experience wasn't really something that was of interest, and they preferred staying, at least for now, with the remote lock screen as the mechanism for the users to be able to kind of sit at and be able to unlock it like they're used to. It's a bit less of a change in their experience, even if the new experience is more secure. So because of all the feedback we've received, we are actively working on enabling a configurable option that we will bring in next calendar year in 2024 that will enable admins to configure the session host through a group policy or Intune policy to decide if you want to disconnect the session, like the default behavior today, or actually go back to showing the remote lock screen. And with that, I think that completes the single sign-on part. So we'll talk a little bit about in-session passwordless before we come back and do some live demos. And then I will just take a quick look. Yeah, so CAE is definitely something we are, thank you for the question, Rio CloudSync. We are planning on enabling full support for continuous access evaluation. That's something that we will be looking into in our next semester. So starting from kind of January through June, we're hoping to start making progress on enabling this. It's definitely something that we want to support. It's not yet fully integrated with Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365 just yet, though. Okay. All right, moving on to, and please, again, keep posting questions. We definitely love that. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So moving on to in-session passwordless. That's generally kind of what we call it, but behind the scene, the feature that enabled that is called WebAuthn redirection. And that's how we provide kind of the new in-session passwordless that provides support for Windows Hello for Business, every type, so Cloud Trust, Cert Trust, Key Trust, and all that, and FIDO keys and future authentication methods inside the session, as long as they go through the standard Windows WebAuthn kind of service or like authentication process, if you want. Part of or another one of the goals for this new technology was we didn't want to expose any of your local biometrics or security device and all that to the remote host. So everything kind of stays locally on your device. And something else that's also really interesting with the new in-session passwordless functionality, contrary to some of our other redirection, this one works great in nested sessions. So sometimes if you have either a jump box scenario or other scenarios where you need to first connect from your local device to a machine and then go from there to your final endpoint, that will work across multiple hops there. How? So what do we do to enable this? Well, the first thing is Windows already includes a component called WebAuthn.dll that ships with Windows. And that is how normally just in Windows, normally, that's the recommended way for applications and applications and websites to request authentication for kind of Windows Hello and FIDO and all that. So applications and websites can call into the WebAuthn component in Windows to complete the authentication by the user using their different devices. So what we've done is we've worked with the enterprise and security team at Microsoft to expose that DLL now as an RDP plugin, which is something that has existed for quite a while, where you can have a component both on your local machine and the remote machine talk to each other over the remote desktop connection. So what we did is we updated the WebAuthn.dll to be able to be kind of loaded both on your local machine and on the remote machine, what we call the terminal service component. So the plugin gets loaded on both sides, and now we've got a channel where we can send communication back and forth as needed. And then we've also added a new RDP property to enable or disable the redirection, but by default, WebAuthn redirection is always enabled. If you have, if you're running we'll get into the requirements. If you're running the right versions of Windows, it's on by default, but as an admin, you always have the option to go turn it off as needed, either through an RDP property, or if you want to make sure that users can't use it, normally you would use either a group policy or an Intune policy to disable that. Then we can move on to the next. Speaking of the prerequisites and what we wanted to do there, so similar to single sign-on, we actually released in the same Windows servicing updates in October 2022. That servicing update included all of the changes for both our single sign-on protocol that we covered earlier and our WebAuthn redirection. So that all came in at the same time. By now, this should be installed on all of the machines, since most folks normally are good about keeping their devices up to date. So that shouldn't be a concern since we're over a year in. But the devices do need to have that servicing update installed on both sides and be running Windows 10, 11, or Windows Server 2022. And then, so as far as the host, that's the only requirement. You just need to have the right update. As far as the local machine, there is currently a requirement that this is supported only on Windows and using the Windows client. So either the AVD or Windows 365 Windows client, or also the Inbox Remote Desktop Connection or MSTAC clients. They have all been updated to support that functionality. I don't remember if we put it on our roadmap slide later, but we will be looking at bringing this functionality to the other platforms starting in the next semester. It's something we'll be investigating and see the feasibility of that, and see if we can bring that into again to other platforms, for example, macOS. FIDO configuration. So to be able to use that, for the users, they do need to have some specific configuration done to be able to support this. That's not really just specific to that feature, but that's just configuration that they normally would have to have enabled to be able to use kind of FIDO keys or kind of Windows Hello for Business in some cases. So they need to be configured properly just for this feature to work in general, but we decided to list them here. So the user does need to be added to the FIDO2 security key authentication method policy. And they also need to have a FIDO device registered in Microsoft Entra ID if they need to do second factor kind of proof up on that point. Okay. Yeah, so we have released or made generally available single sign-on for Windows 365 Enterprise, both Entra joined cloud PCs and Entra hybrid joined cloud PCs. We are still actively working on bringing that functionality to Windows 365 for Business. So again, great question, and thank you for asking, Rio CloudSync. That's something we hope to bring in fairly early next year, definitely in the first half of the year. We're working through the method for admin to enable and disable single sign-on, and for business, when you enable or disable single sign-on, it will automatically apply to all of the business cloud PCs in that tenant. But definitely something we will be bringing to market as soon as we can from that perspective. Similar to single sign-on, let's talk a little bit about what the flow looks like through a quick kind of flow diagram here. Starting on the left side, this is essentially your remote host, right? So you're actively in your remote session and you go to, for example, a browser, and you open up a browser that needs re-authentication inside the session. And the browser itself or the website will trigger a WebAuthn request, like I mentioned. That web request naturally goes to the Windows component that handles WebAuthn's authentication. And then it detects that it's running inside of a remote session. And then it will package the request and send it over to the term serve. DVC in this case is a dynamic virtual channel, or in our RDP plugin is very similar to that. So the request is sent to our kind of the term serve on the server, which then sends it across the wire with the RDP plugin to your local remote desktop client that's running on your local machine. That client will then hand it over to the WebAuthn service that's running on your local device. And then the WebAuthn component will go through its standard authentication flow, where we'll prompt for FIDO keys and Windows 11 for Business and all that. Once the user completes the authentication locally, essentially the response to that request that has been completed makes its way all the way back to the session and into the browser to complete the authentication. And that's in part why it works in a nested session. So if the browser was in the nested session, when it gets to the WebAuthn service on the right, that would still be in a remote session, that one would also detect that it's still running in a remote session and then send it back one hop, and so on and so forth until it gets to your local machine, until it detects that it's running on the local machine. Okay, let's keep moving on for the sake of time. I want to make sure you have enough time for all the demos and everything else, Sandeep. Yep. So I will turn it back over to you and keep an eye on questions. Thanks, Sandeep.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to go for the demo. Okay, so what I want to do is, so we talked about, so there are going to be 3 demos I'm going to be doing. One is on the single sign-on for Windows. We'll skip the web client part today because of time, just doing it at real time. We'll do the WebAuthn redirection, and then we'll do the SSO configuration, right, that admins would do to bypass the consent prompt. So what I have is, I'm going to first show you my quick settings. So I'm going to use Woodgrove, which is my tenant. Are folks able to see my screen right now?
Yeah, I can see it, Sandeep.
Okay. So you can see I've already added my credential here, my account, Sandio at Woodgrove, right? That is the one that I'm going to use for this demo. So the first thing I'll do is I will launch a remote desktop client. This is the AVD native RDP client. And here you'll see I get SSO for getting the feed because I have a PRT on this machine. I've already logged in with my account and all of that. So I do get access to the feed without, having to do any additional thing. And that's because my conditional access policy, I think, just said required MFA. And I already had satisfied MFA when I did the ad work account for, my tenant, right, on my local PC. So this is the view that you initially see for the RDP client. And I have 2 session desktops here, 1 and 2. I'll show with 1 how you see the consent prompt and how you can connect. And with 2, we'll start with showing the consent prompt. Then I'll go basically configure the SSO policy, and then we'll try and reconnect, and you'll see that consent prompt doesn't show up, right? I'm going to start to connect to desktop 1. Now this is where I'm going to be, because the SSO policy isn't configured, and I'm using, deliberately, I'm going to use a password here. And I'll tell you why, because if I use the other option, I do get asked for my FIDO key. And I don't want to use that because I also want to show you the WebAuthn redirection on the target device, right? If I use FIDO key, then those, the PRT that you get on the target will have that claim, and I won't be able to show you the WebAuthn demo. So I'm going to use this, which I hate. I don't typically use passwords anymore, but I'm doing this for this specific scenario. So I have to do cancel here to see these other ways to sign in. I'm going to use my Authenticator app. And trust me, I'm getting this, and I'll show you if you're able to see that I got the push notification. I'm using that number. Okay, so this is the prompt you see, right? It is asking me, hey, I'm attempting to connect to a remote device, and it gives me the host name. Is it okay? Now I'm going to select yes. So again, this demo was about, I've been asked to re-authenticate, right? Because the SSO policy isn't configured. So I do the authentication. I'm shown the consent prompt. I say yes, and that's when I get into the target device. Okay. But at least you saw that I was able to use my passwordless credential to RDP, which was using phone sign-in. Now here I'm on the target device. And then I'm going to launch into Edge. Okay, and before that, I want to show you something else, right? So that way we are clear as to why we are seeing this. I'm going to show you the conditional access policy that I have configured. So you will see why I'm getting prompted for the WebAuthn. I'll show you this. Okay, so I have a WebAuthn test policy. And if you see what I have done here is, I have included, I'm saying I require authentication strength, and I'm saying require phishing resistant, which includes things like, FIDO2 security key. And the resource I have selected is my apps, right? So let me go back to see here, because I had PRT on the target device, my Edge profile was already created using the PRT, right? So I did already get SSO where I didn't have to go re-authenticate to create the profile in Edge, right? So now I have this Edge profile created. Okay, now I'm going to go to my apps. And here's what I'm going to do, right? Before I click that, I'm going to lower this window so you see the actual WebAuthn prompt coming from my local machine, right? So I'm going to hit this. See, I've been asked for this. See, I can move it out. So this is actually coming on my local device. I'm going to use my PIN, and I've been asked to touch the key. I touch the key. Trust me, I have it here, the FIDO key on my local machine, and voila, I'm in, right, onto my apps. So we saw the regular RDP to the session desktop 1. We saw the WebAuthn redirection from that session desktop 1 that I connected to using FIDO, right? So we saw 2 of the 3 demos. Now for the third demo, I'm going to try and connect to a session desktop 2, which I haven't consented to previously. So you're going to see that consent screen show up again, right? This is.
Did you enable single sign-on on that host pool?
Okay. So I think, okay, that's a good point, David. So let's do that. So I have a second host pool here, and I can go to RDP properties. Okay,
you get to see at the same time where you go to enable single sign-on on a host pool in Azure Virtual Desktop. So it's one of the RDP properties like Sandeep is showing up here.
Correct. Let me assure you, we didn't stage this. This just so happened that I forgot, and you guys also got to see where to go set it. Okay.
Okay. So make sure you refresh your feed on your client before you.
Correct. So I'm going to go close the desktop 1. I'm going to go here, and I'm just going to refresh the feed. So it has the new updated RDP property. Okay, so this is refreshed. I'm going to now try and connect to session desktop 2. It will have the same experience like we saw in the first one, where it will ask me to authenticate and it will show me the consent prompt. I'm just going to do it so you know that I have not configured the SSO policy. I'm going to cancel it like I canceled last time and try to use other ops, right? So I'm going to use phone authenticator. I got the request again. I'm going to try and authenticate here, and it will show me the consent prompt. Okay, this time I'm just going to close this because you know that the SSO wasn't configured, right? Now we'll take a quick look so you get to see what exactly we are doing here. With this host pool, if I go to the application groups, I'll show you the session hosts that are part of these Sorry, where am I? I'm in the application. Sorry, I should be back in the host pool. And you'll see the session hosts that I have in this host pool are, come on. So they are AVD SH012, right? And the reason I was telling you 012 is you'll see I have gone and created a device group with that, because that's what we want to use to configure the policy. What did I create with AVD? Okay, so I created a AVD self-host test devices, and you'll get to see the members quickly. It's the same members that we saw that were part of the host pool. Now, here's what we need to go do, right? I've already created this group. I'm going to first go, I'll show you how to configure the property. So I'm in my MS Graph, I'm in the Graph Explorer, which allows you to configure the policy using MS Graph API. So I'm going to first sign in to that using my Woodgrove account. Okay. And I'll show you the first thing, which is if I have to go and find the application ID for Microsoft Remote Desktop, because that's the app we want to go set the policy, the Remote Desktop policy on. I'm going to go check for Microsoft Remote. Okay, this is the one. You can do it using both either application ID or object ID. In this example, I'm going to use the object ID. It's a different syntax though. We'll have the docs updated to let you know exactly how to use application ID if that's more convenient. So here's what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to first go do a quick paste that ID, and I'm going to show you what the current remote desktop configuration is. So it's a object on, it's a relationship property on the service principal. So if I do a query, here's the response you get. The default state is the remote desktop protocol enabled is false, and there are no target device groups configured as part of that, right? Now, I'll tell you what these two things are, right? The first property is to enable this new protocol behavior, right? So when the client is trying to do a handshake, and when the client is actually connecting to Entra to say, hey, give me the new RDP access token, if this property is set to false, you would not get that RDP access token, right? We haven't enforced this behavior yet, but it will soon be enforced once we have Windows Cloud Login as a new resource updated early next year, right? So we'll get to that. And the second portion of the policy is the target device groups. So the way you do that is you come and configure group IDs. You can do one by one. We support up to like 10 groups in the policy. So any devices that are member of those groups will be basically exempted from the consent prompt. So based on the other way to say that is, or another way to say that is, any devices that are in the groups that you configure as part of this policy will get the single sign-on behavior, right? So the first thing you do is you first go update the remote desktop configuration by setting it to true, right? And I'm just taking an example that we have in our docs. Just going to go paste it. So the first thing I do is I'm going to set this to true. Now, if I go back and query my remote desktop, it should come back as it's set to true, right? The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to target device groups and configure that, right? That is the second thing that I mentioned that you need to do. So I'm going to first go and do a create on the target device group. For that, you have to do a post. So I'm going to copy this part and I'll replace it with the ID. Okay, I'll come there in a minute. Just taking this. And then we're going to do a post with target device groups. For that, I'm going to need the ID of the device. So I'm going to go back to where we created the group. Test devices. I'm going to pick from the properties, I'm going to pick the object ID of that group. And although you can give any name, I'm going to match this so that for consistency, I'm going to give the name that this is my, okay. So I'm going to go ahead and create this, right? Now, if I go and just do a get on this, okay, here you'll see the property is enabled to true and the target device group is already included. So now, if I go back, and I hope this is all real time, and there's no delays involved here. But now if I go back, because the session hosts that are part of this session desktop are part of the dynamic, are a part of this group, basically, the target device group that we configured, voila, I got SSO. I wasn't shown that re-authentication experience. I wasn't shown the consent prompt. I just came all the way through from my client where I had already artifact for my Woodgrove tenant. So even though this is my Microsoft desktop with my Microsoft credentials as the primary, because I also have a work account with Woodgrove, I had the PRT. I was able to get that same SSO all the way through to the target device.
So Sandeep, while you switch back to the slide deck, just a quick note, we've got about 3 to 5 minutes before we have to wrap up. But I'll let you reload the slide deck. In the meantime, there was a question from Venkatesh on, I believe, LinkedIn. That we wanted to answer. So the question was, which protocol is helping during the AVD SSO? Technically, internally, we call it like RDS AVD Auth, but it's essentially a new authentication protocol. So in the past, when connecting to Microsoft Entra joined machines, you only had one primary option, which was PKU to be able to connect. And then for AVD and Windows 365, we had temporarily enabled the ability to use a different protocol called RDS TLS, which enabled you to connect from machines that weren't joined to the same domain or from non-Windows clients, but it was very limited to username and password only. So SSO is now actually using a brand new protocol. Again, internally, we call it RDS AD Auth, or if you want Microsoft Entra ID authentication for remote desktop, if you want a more friendly name. But that is the new protocol we're using for the authentication.
Yeah.
Sandeep, do you have the...
Yeah.
There
yeah, and I would also encourage to, if you can go back on one of the slides where we cover about the how, where we talk about the changes we did in the different components, to give you an idea as to what was the rationale, why we did it, and how we went about doing it. Just as a quick refresher but great question again. So like David mentioned, we just have a few minutes. We just wanted to quickly wrap up with some of the key items. Again, this is not an exhaustive list of the things that we're working on. But some of the next key things that we will enable next year is the ability to provide re-authentication support. So this is a little bit of a contrary to, in fact, it is contrary to the SSO experience. So some customers have expressed the need that, if I'm connecting from my personal machine or some shared machine, I don't want to get that SSO all the way, right, every time. So I want that client to be, prompted for re-authentication every so often. So even though you won't see the consent prompt, you will still see the prompt for authenticating back to your target device, right? Every 15 minutes. So within the first 15, yes, you get that SSO, but you come back later, you should be prompted to re-authenticate. And if it's, if it requires MFA or additional strong authentication, you're supposed to meet that before you get access to your target device. The other thing, like David mentioned today, we have the experience on FIDO for Windows. We are working on adding support for Mac, iOS, and Android. So that will also be something that we are super excited to bring to our customers. Another key capability that a lot of AVD and Windows 365 customers are asking is about supporting B2B user logon. So when you create when you host this environment for your partners and you want them to come in and access your resources, today natively we do not support this. So we are adding support for enabling this for pure RDP scenarios. So you can use a guest account to RDP to your AVD that's hosted by the resource tenant or Windows 365 PC for that matter. So that's something that we are again super excited and looking forward to bringing it to our customers. Another area as part of our executive order commitment is to bring certificate-based auth support for Linux clients when they are used to connect to AVD or Windows 365 PC. Right now, I showed you a demo with all the MS Graph API experience for configuring the SSO policy. We do not have an admin UX yet. This is something we will be actively looking at next year to bring to our customers, which is a simpler way through the admin UX to configure the SSO policies, where you're able to enable the RDP property on off. You're able to configure the groups, add, remove as and how you want to manage them. And then a couple of things David had mentioned was around the WebAuthn support for non-Windows, like bring support for Mac, iOS, and so on. And there was something else, David, I think you had mentioned. That is, sorry, CAE, right? We also want to look into bringing continuous access evaluation support for AVD and Windows 365 workload. So I think we went a little over, but I think that's sort of, unless David, you had a few additional things you wanted to cover, but that's sort of.
No, I think that's it. Just wanted to say thank you for everyone that posted great questions. So thank you, Mark, for that. We know about B2B. We just wanted to plug it in so folks actually know we're working on it. We don't have more details to share yet, but it's very much top of mind for Sandeep and I as we roll into calendar year 2024. And with that, I will turn it over to Grace to wrap us up for today. And thank you, everyone, for joining this morning.
Yep.
Evening, afternoon, wherever you're at.
Thank you. And you all have a great holiday and Happy New Year.
Well, thank you so much. There was a lot that we went through today for passwordless SSO in AVD and WebAuthn redirection for in-session passwordless auth. One might say this session was stuffed with knowledge, but I wouldn't unless I was hosting the last live show of the year, trying to get in a ridiculous amount of holiday puns. So as you've heard, this was no small feat and required changes across products, patches, portals, passwords, and protocols. So if you want to go back and listen again, this video, along with all our other shows, will be available at aka.ms/45show/videos. With that, we will wrap, last pun I promise, up today's show. So thank you very much to my guests, Sandeep and David, and you, our viewers, for tuning in and contributing. From everyone at the 45 show, we wish you all happy holidays and hope you have a rested break. And we will see you refreshed in 2024 for new shows, including the return of our What's New in Entra ID monthly series, deep dives, and much more. So thank you very much. We'll see you next year.
Cheers, guys. Bye.